Hello everyone, welcome to History of Israel 101, a podcast about Israeli history for those already familiar with it. Today we will talk about the history of the Maccabee Revolt and about the strategic decisions that the opposing sides took during that war. My name is Yigal Levin, and our esteemed guest today is Professor Yigal Levin of Bar-Ilan University. Professor Levin is a senior lecturer in the Israel and Golda Kaczynski Department of Jewish History at Bar-Ilan. His main areas of interest are history, society, and religion of biblical Israel, Israel in the Persian period, biblical historical geography, and the interface between history, Bible, and archaeology. As our viewers undoubtedly know, Maccabee Revolt took place when non-Hellenized population of Judah rebelled against the Seleucid Empire in 167 BCE. The event is still extremely important, culturally speaking, to the modern state of Israel, and so we would like to explore it in great detail. Professor Levin, thank you very much for joining us today. Before we move on to the Maccabee Revolt itself, I just wanted to ask you one personal question. I find your profession and history in general to be very fascinating. How did you come to actually go into it as a profession?
I've always been interested in history and in archaeology and in traveling and in geography ever since I was a child. But basically, when I completed my military service in Israel, I took the various university catalogs and crossed off anything I did not want to study. I eventually ended up with Land of Israel studies and history and law. And so I applied to all of them. And then at some point, I decided that I didn't want to really be a lawyer. So that's how I ended up in history.
Well, I just want to say personally that I'm glad you did. Okay, so, well, as our viewers know, the Maccabee Rebellion was against the Seleucid Empire. Could you possibly tell us how did the Seleucid Empire came to control Judah in the first place?
Okay, well, that basically goes back to 333 BCE, when Alexander the Great took over the entire Persian Empire, which is a story on its own, but we're not going to get into that. The land of Judah, of course, was part of the Persian Empire, a very small, very marginal part of the Persian Empire. Important because it was close to the frontier of the Persians with Egypt. And Egypt, although Egypt had been conquered by the Persians 200 years previously, Egypt had rebelled against the Persians several times. In fact, the Persians just reconquered Egypt a few decades before that. So nominally, Persia was in control of Egypt as well, but it was really a frontier. So Alexander came down the coast. He destroyed the city of Tyre. There are various stories, various legends within rabbinic literature about Alexander's possible meetings with the Jews on his way, although none of the Greek sources about Alexander's campaigns actually mention this. Josephus does, but he apparently takes the story from rabbinic literature, from proto-rabbinic literature. But none of the actual Greek sources mentions any kind of meeting between Alexander and the Jews. And after Alexander's death, his empire was divided between his successors, the so-called Diadochi. One of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, took over Egypt, and after a short war with some of the other successors, also found himself in control of the land of Israel, of the entire Levant, and of Cyprus as well, for that matter. The Seleucids initially based themselves in Babylonia, but eventually shifted more and more of their activity towards the area of Syria, and eventually constructed the city of Antioch on the Syrian coast as their capital. And for several decades, these two successor kingdoms of Alexander, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, fought each other until finally, just around the year 200, the Seleucid king Antiochus III managed to conquer the Levant, the land of Israel, from the Ptolemies, going all the way to the border of what today would be the Sinai Desert, and the entire area came under Seleucid rule. So it just happened several decades before the Maccabean Revolt.
As far as I know, the Maccabees rebelled because of the policies pursued by Antiochus IV. What were the policies of the Seleucid Empire towards Jews before him, before Antiochus IV?
Okay, well, I'll start off by saying that in the ancient world, in the pagan world, in the ancient Near East, and in the Hellenistic and Roman world, governments on one hand used religion, used cult in order to support their own legitimacy. In other words, kings were considered to be either divine or semi-divine, or at least have the support of the dynastic and national gods. On the other hand, in a polytheistic world, nobody really cared who worshipped what. And we have very few cases of imperial governments getting involved in local religion, in local court, except as a source of keeping control. But they didn't really care who followed what rituals. And in a polytheistic world, obviously, the more gods you worship, the better, because then you're hedging your bets in all directions. So the idea of an imperial government imposing restrictions on religious observances was unheard of and unprecedented. From all of the sources that we have, both the Ptolemies and Antiochus III, when he took over the land of Israel from the Ptolemies, were extremely tolerant towards Judaism in general, recognized the Jewish high priest as the leader of the Jewish nation, gave him support in enforcing or upholding Jewish religious ritual and law as they were understood at the time among the Jewish population, with the understanding, of course, that Jews would not bother anyone who was not Jewish from practicing their own religion. Okay, there was no reason for Jews to get involved in how other people practice their religion as well. So there was really no reason for Antiochus IV to get himself involved in Jewish practice.
In which case, if you say that it was unprecedented for a polytheistic empire to impose or restrict religious practices, why did Antiochus IV decide to suppress Jewish religion?
Okay, well here it depends what sources you're following. It's a matter of sources. Remember that our sources about the Maccabean Revolt and the events leading up to it are, first of all, from the later written Jewish books of the Maccabees. Okay, first Maccabees, second Maccabees, third and fourth Maccabees as well, though they go on to different subjects, but mostly first and second Maccabees, which were written by different people at different times with different outlooks. They're not a sequel of each other. They don't follow each other. And then Josephus mostly paraphrases first and second Maccabees, also adds some of his own material. And then much later, rabbinic writings reflecting about that period. We don't have any real Greek sources about the relationship between the Seleucid Empire and the Jews. So, first of all, everything we say, everything we know is basically one-sided. It's how the Jews remembered their conflict with the Seleucid Empire, and not beyond that. Now, if you go to rabbinic sources, or even to Josephus or to the books of Maccabees, you can see that during the years leading up to the revolt, from the Seleucid takeover of the land of Israel, there was a growing trend among the elites within Jewish society, among whom were the priests, to adopt to a large measure a Hellenistic civilization, Hellenistic culture. First of all, because it was considered to be the more cosmopolitan, more modern, but besides that, because it was also a way of getting close to the government. And this was convenient for the imperial government because what held the empire together was in fact that stratum of people who were becoming Greek not as an ethnic term, but as a cultural term. In other words, adopting Greek norm, Greek language, Greek dress, Greek architecture, Greek education, and Greek religion as well as part of what held the empire together. So this was convenient for the empire itself. We know from Maccabees and from Josephus that in the years leading up to the revolt, several high priests bought their way to their position by bribing the king, or more likely bribing the king's officials, since, again, I doubt that the king himself was really involved in what was going on in the temple in Jerusalem. There was a conflict between the more Hellenistic-leaning factions within Jewish society, especially in the city of Jerusalem, and those who were more traditional. And at some point, apparently, those who were leaning towards Hellenistic culture, not necessarily adopting Hellenistic Greek religion, but leaning towards Hellenistic culture, adoption of Hellenistic culture, turned to the king's officials, and said, well, why aren't you intervening in our behalf? Why aren't you making things easier for us? Why do we have to fight with these traditionalists about the way we're going to be integrated into the empire? So later Jewish memory remembered High Priest Jason, High Priest Menelaus as Hellenizers, as people who brought Greek norms and Greek worship into the temple, but we don't really have any way of knowing if it went that far. Okay, it was a matter of who you're listening to, what historical voices are you listening to. We also are not really sure whether what later sources remembered as the edicts or the edicts of Antiochus, Antiochus, anti-Jewish proclamations, not allowing observance of the Sabbath, not allowing circumcision, not allowing eating of kosher food, and so on, actually happened before the rebellion, or whether they were a result of the rebellion. In any case, what I can say is that the only way that Antiochus, his advisors, could have even been aware of the fact that eating kosher food or not eating non-kosher food, observing the Sabbath, circumcision, were considered to be such basic components of Jewish religion that to not allow them would be taken as a very hard blow against Jewish religion. Okay, I don't think that they could have imagined that that would be the case.
Do we know of any practical measures that the Seleucid Empire took to enforce those edicts that you spoke about?
Not outside of legend. In other words, rabbinic sources, and before them Josephus, and before them Second Maccabees mostly, have lots of stories about the way in which the Greeks, and I'm using Greeks here again as a cultural term since we're not talking about people from Greece, try to enforce their prohibitions, their religious restrictions on the Jews. Okay, there's the famous story about the woman and her seven sons. Okay, in later sources she received the name Hannah, but in the earlier sources she's actually unnamed, who at one point a Greek official came into a village and set up an altar to Greek gods, to Zeus or whatever gods, and gathered the townspeople and tried to force this leading family, this woman with her 7 children, with her 7 sons, to worship at this altar, and one after another, they all refused and were executed. Now, how historical that is, we really have no way of knowing. It's a story which has a very powerful message. I would say even further, the reason that these stories, in other words, the reason that the books of First and Second Maccabees, and in fact Josephus as well, have come down to us, is because they were preserved by the Christian church, because the Christian church eventually came to see these stories as being examples of the kind of martyrdom that is expected of Christians, not because Jewish tradition preserved them. Jewish tradition preserved other aspects, but again, similar stories in slightly different forms, but from much later sources.
You just explained that it was, in a way, a struggle between the Hellenized elite of Israel and non-Hellenized people of Israel. What were the aims of the rebels? Whom were they rebelling against? What did they want to achieve?
Again, depends what sources you listen to. According to the book of Maccabees, the initial leaders of the rebellion were Mattathias, who was a priest living in Modi'in, not quite sure if before that he had originally officiated in the temple and had left Jerusalem because of what he considered to be impure practices that were happening in the temple. This is how later rabbinic sources understood this, but the book of Maccabees doesn't actually say this. But he was living in Modi'in, which, by the way, was administratively or politically outside of the province of Judah. It was in the province of Samaria, the village of Modi'in at that time. But living in Modi'in, had 5 sons. Again, a Greek official came into town. It was a primarily Jewish town or village. A Greek official came into town, set up an altar to Zeus, tried to force the townspeople to worship at this altar. In this case, instead of being martyred, Mattathias took a sword and struck. Okay, when one of the Jews did approach this altar, Mattathias took a sword and struck him through, and then called out, okay, a cry of, okay, those who are for God, come with me. And then they all fled into the hills. We don't really know what they thought to achieve at that point. In other words, at that point, from what we understand, we're talking about a fairly small group of people who had just realized that because their leader had struck down someone who was worshiping at a Greek altar, obviously the Greek soldiers were going to come after them, so they were hiding in caves, and apparently more and more people flocked to them. What their aims at this point was, we really don't know. But eventually, I would say, the more successful they became, since at first they fought against local Seleucid garrisons, which were not all that capable, were not the Seleucid Empire's elite soldiers, obviously. The next set of battles was against the military governor of Samaria. As I said, the town of Modi'in was actually in the province of Samaria, but the province of Judah, which was a very small and poor province, didn't really have a large standing Seleucid garrison. So the garrison from Samaria came in and were defeated. And the more these rebels managed to defeat the various expeditionary forces that were sent against them, apparently their appetite grew. And they began thinking about, well, okay, if we manage to fight off the Greek army, then maybe our next stage should be to take over Jerusalem and to purify the city and the temple. Now again, with what the city and the temple were exactly defiled is not really all that clear, because we don't really know that the Hellenizing faction within the Jerusalem priesthood had adopted Greek gods or had set up Greek idols in the temple or whatever. We don't really know that. We have hints at this, or at least we have hints at the idea that maybe this is how the more traditional faction thought of what was going on in the temple. Okay, many scholars, for example, date parts of the book of Daniel to this period, where an abomination was set up in the temple. But we don't really know, okay, for 100% that this was the historical situation. But at some point, as the group of rebels began fighting off the Greek forces, they apparently did set their sights on Jerusalem, and made it their mission to take over Jerusalem, to set worship in the temple back as they felt it should be. Apparently also, there was more than one group of rebels. In other words, they were acting together as a kind of unified group, but there were different groups with different motivations. Our sources mention a group that are called the Assadeans, which we assume is a Greek form. Remember, all our sources are in Greek. Is a Greek form of what in Hebrew would be Hasidim, in other words, pious. And maybe these were people whose main motivation was purely religious, while other people may have had more political inclinations, more political goals. But we really don't know exactly how where they set their limits. The book of Maccabees, especially First Maccabees, puts a whole bunch of speeches in the mouths of Juda Maccabee and later his brothers who succeeded him in leadership, Jonathan and then Simon, which make it sound like from the very beginning they understood themselves as fighting for political freedom, fighting to regain control of their ancestral homeland. The problem is that we really don't know how authentic these speeches are. In other words, they certainly represent the way the writers of the book of Maccabees wanted later generations to understand the struggle. Whether they represent what that generation, what that group of rebels actually had in mind is something we really don't know.
Do we have any non-Jewish sources describing this phase of the rebellion?
No.
Okay. You said that the rebels have managed to defeat, all the local garrisons and even the garrison at Samaria. How did a relatively apparently small group, or even several relatively small groups, manage to do that?
From what we can tell, classic guerrilla warfare. In other words, they were locals, they knew the land, they knew the hiding places, they knew the back roads, the dirt roads going to, various places. Well, all roads then were dirt, but the back roads going to various places. They felt that they were fighting for their home towns and villages. They apparently had the support, or at least the support of some of the local villagers, even those who didn't join them in arms, but supported them logistically, supported them with food, supported them with hiding places, while the Greek forces, even the local garrisons, were not really local. They didn't know the land as well. They didn't have the support of the villagers, of the common population. Even if they were garrisoned in towns like Jerusalem or in fortresses such as Beth Sur or other places, they apparently didn't spend a lot of time in the countryside outside of that area. Once forces from Samaria began coming in, then they were total strangers to that specific part of the land. And that's what apparently played in the favor in the rebels' favor.
And how did the rebels secure the support of other Jews? I'm asking because I know that because it's obvious that there were Jews who were quite supportive of the Seleucid rule, and yet some other people supported the rebellion.
So from what we can understand, a lot of it was a matter of urban elites versus rural population, where the urban elites were more prone to support the Hellenistic faction. The rural population was more conservative, as tends to happen in many different places, many different periods of time. The rural population was more conservative, and the rebels came from that rural population. Again, remember, the rebellion didn't start in Jerusalem. It started in a small village called Modi'in, which, was a small village. And we also have to remember that when I talk about urban elites, I'm talking about a very small number of people. Even the city of Jerusalem, which was the only city to speak of in the province of Judah at the time, was a very, very, very small city. From what we understand from archaeology, the city of Jerusalem at that time was only what today we would call the city of David and the Temple Mount. In other words, only the eastern spur of ancient Jerusalem, not even the entire old city of today. So it was a very small city. And if we talk about who the urban elites were in that city, basically a group of priests and officials, and we have no idea how much common support they had.
How was the Seleucid Empire doing fighting the rebels, and why did it seemingly fail to defeat them? They could have sent a huge army, for example, if they wanted to.
Well, the Seleucid Empire was in trouble. The Seleucid Empire reached its peak under the reign of Antiochus III, who was known as Antiochus the Great, until he got into trouble with the Romans. Rome at this point was still there's still the Roman Republic, but it was beginning to expand towards the east, and the Romans basically forced Antiochus III to pay the Romans a lot of money in order to pay them for the war that they had previously waged against them, which pretty much brought the Seleucid a treasury to a breaking point. The Romans also forced Antiochus III to send his sons to live as hostages in Rome itself. In fact, when Antiochus III was assassinated, his oldest son was not able to, was a hostage in Rome and was not able to take over the kingdom from him, which is what led Antiochus IV to be able to take over the kingdom. But that set off a struggle between different factions within the Seleucid family. And that resonated, that struggle continued for the next several generations. So Antiochus IV had an older brother who was king before him, who was assassinated by an official by the name of Heliodorus, who was known from the book of Maccabees as well, as someone who tried to plunder the temple. We don't have any external evidence of that, but according to the second Maccabees, Heliodorus tried to plunder the temple in Jerusalem and was stopped by 3 angels who stopped him in mid plunder. So Antiochus IV managed to take over the kingdom, and in order to gain support, started spreading money all over the place, which he didn't have. So, and then he went to try to conquer Egypt, and he was stopped by the Romans there. And he returned to Syria in humiliation. He was humiliated by the Romans. The Romans basically sent a single ambassador to Egypt who drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and was standing there with his whole army and said, by the time you step out of this circle, decide whether you're going to leave Egypt or face Rome. And Antiochus realized that there was no way he could face Rome, and he left Egypt. There may have been a rumor that broke out in Jerusalem at that time that Antiochus had been killed on this Egyptian campaign. So certain people in Jerusalem began to celebrate Antiochus' death. But again, this is, we only know from Jewish sources, not from Greek sources, so we're not really sure of the timeline here, which caused Antiochus, or at least his army, to plunder Jerusalem and plunder the temple, or try to plunder the temple. That may have been the moment of the defilement of the temple that we hear of. In other words, not something done by the Hellenistic-leaning high priest, but rather by Antiochus' army. But again, we really don't know, because our sources tend to contradict each other. And again, they're all later Jewish sources. There are no actual Greek sources about any of this. Antiochus himself died in, I think it was 164, apparently on a campaign, off towards Persia. Again, one of the rumors has it that he died plundering a temple somewhere in the east, which seems to fit into this, this idea. And after he died, since his brother had also been king, and his brother had a son, and he had a son, a kind of struggle broke out between these 2 cousins over who was rightful king. And just at that point, the Maccabean rebels managed, that's the point at which the Maccabean rebels managed to take over Jerusalem. 164 is when the Maccabees managed to take over Jerusalem. So apparently that had to do with the fact that the whole huge Seleucid army was busy elsewhere. And then, since the Seleucid dynasty was in a period of disarray and of struggle between the various factions, the Maccabees managed to take advantage of this in order to solidify their own power over Jerusalem. Although we do have to remember that just a couple of years after the Maccabees took over Jerusalem and cleansed the temple and celebrated Hannukah in whatever form they celebrated it. We're not really sure what that meant at the time. The Seleucids did manage to send a general who was strong enough to retake Jerusalem. Judah was killed in battle. His brother Jonathan found himself leading a group of refugees in the desert. The city of Jerusalem was returned to Seleucid control. And the way that Jonathan managed to retake Jerusalem was again by joining himself to one of the warring factions within the Seleucid kingdom, who basically gave him Jerusalem, as a gift.
I understand that Seleucids have made certain concessions to Maccabees after they returned to Jerusalem. Why did they do it, and what were the concessions?
The concessions were basically to recognize their rule in Jerusalem, but as I said, this was temporary because then they came and attacked again. But at least at first, their concessions were, okay, we recognize the Maccabees as being in control of Jerusalem. We will not try to interfere with Jewish religion anymore. Okay, that was basically the concession. The fact is that we don't really know to what extent Maccabee control of the temple at that point actually happened. For example, we don't have any sources that claim that Judah himself was ever appointed high priest. Okay, we don't know that. We know the first high priest that we know of the Maccabean family was Jonathan after Judah's death and after they were restored to Jerusalem. And Jonathan was appointed high priest by the Seleucid government. In other words, the Seleucids, at least in theory, retained control over the province of Judah and even over the high priesthood. Okay, even retained the right to appoint high priests. Then the Seleucid kingdom basically fell apart, not because of anything the Maccabees did. The Seleucid kingdom fell apart because of the war between the various factions within the Seleucid kingdom, and first Jonathan, and then who was, by the way, assassinated by one of the Seleucid claimants to the throne, and then his brother Simon, who managed to take over the leadership from that time, became more and more independent because the Seleucid kingdom basically lost its control of the area. In other words, it wasn't that the Maccabees pushed the Seleucids out, it was that the Seleucids left because they were busy with their own problems and the Maccabees were in place to take over.
As we have discussed earlier, this was at least partially, or probably even mainly, the revolt against the Hellenization of Judah. How did the Hellenized Jews feel about the revolt, and how did they fare in its aftermath?
We have no idea. In other words, our sources, which are again written after the fact by the descendants or by the successors of the rebels, talk about the Hellenized Jews as idol worshippers, criminals, non-God-fearers, and basically talk about them being expelled from Jerusalem and expelled from the country. Now, whether that actually happened? Okay, obviously those who were specifically personally involved in the Seleucid government probably, yes, were either expelled or executed or whatever, but the others, we don't really know. And it's important to remember that within about 2 generations, the Hasmonean dynasty, the descendants of Simon, Judah's brother, became a very Hellenized dynasty in itself. They didn't Hellenize Jewish religious practice. They remained faithful to Jewish religious practice, but in everything else, they became a very Hellenized dynasty. So, including even adopting Greek names for themselves. The first generation of rulers, of Maccabean rulers, we know by their Hebrew names. The second generation we know by Hebrew and Greek names. The third generation we know mostly by their Greek names, where we sometimes guess at what Hebrew names they may have had. So the dynasty became Hellenized in itself.
The Maccabees have succeeded in taking the cities. Until then, they were essentially guerrillas. Did their tactics and strategy change after taking the cities, and did it have any effect on their success against the Seleucid Empire?
Okay, so first of all, not cities, city.
City.
The only city in the province of Judah was Jerusalem. There weren't any other cities. Remember, the province of Judah, we assume because we really don't have any other information, but we assume that the province of Judah at the time of the Maccabean revolt was the same province of Judah as it had been during the Persian period, which meant basically it was about 40 or 50 kilometers, okay, long and 40 and 50 kilometers. Okay, it was a square of 40 to 50 kilometers around with Jerusalem in its center. Okay, so about 25 kilometers south of Jerusalem. In other words, not even going as far south as Hebron. About 25 kilometers north of Jerusalem, so not even going as far north as Shechem. Maybe including Jericho, but Jericho was a small village at the time. And maybe, probably not including Gezer, which was apparently a Hellenized city towards the west. So that's it. So there weren't any real cities. So the only city was Jerusalem. We don't really know what the Maccabees did with Jerusalem besides cleanse the temple and, take over the city the first time they took it over. Again, this is what's celebrated by Hannukah, but we don't really know any more than that because, as I said, Judah was killed and the Maccabees were actually expelled from the city shortly after that. When they returned, they made Jerusalem their capital. About a generation later, they also began expanding the city physically. Okay, again, we don't really know, but apparently the expansion of the city to the western hill, where the Jewish quarter is now, happened during the leadership of John Hyrcanus I, who was Simon's son. So the second generation, perhaps, began expanding the city and repairing the temple or expanding the temple, and maybe fortifying the Temple Mount as well. And one of our problems archaeologically with the Temple Mount, besides the fact that we can't really excavate there, we've never been able to excavate there, is that when Herod, many years later, rebuilt the temple, he basically obliterated anything that was there before. So even if it was possible to excavate on the Temple Mount, we probably wouldn't find a lot of the Hasmonean temple. And so we don't really know exactly what the temple precincts would have looked like. But at that point, in other words, from the time of Simon onwards, the Hasmoneans did base themselves in Jerusalem, and they became a much more urban ruling dynasty, like a lot of ruling dynasties. They became more urban-based. They became part of the elite. Remember, they themselves were priests. So when they took over the high priesthood, they became part of the high priesthood. And perhaps one theory is that the people who eventually became the Qumran sect, the Dead Sea Scrolls people, left Jerusalem because they were opponents of the Hasmoneans and considered their takeover of the high priesthood to be illegitimate. That's at least one theory. We're not really certain about this, but that's one leading theory about that. And then they basically became the elite rulers of Jerusalem. They replaced the previous elite rulers and they became the elite rulers themselves.
In light of everything that has been said, did the Maccabees achieve their political and religious goals?
Religious goals, apparently, yes. In other words, they took over the temple. So I guess you could say they restored the temple to what they believed, the way they believed the temple should have been run, which is not under Hellenistic influence. As I said at the beginning, we don't really know what their political goals were at first, but eventually they came to see themselves and were apparently recognized by others as an independent kingdom. Only 2 generations later did the Maccabean rulers actually begin calling themselves king, taking the title of king, but they were apparently recognized. The book of Maccabees quotes what are presented as letters between the Maccabean rulers and the people of Sparta in Greece and the Roman Senate, which imply recognition of those international powers as, recognition of the Maccabean state as being independent. Whether those letters are authentic or not is something that, that historians debate about. We don't really know, since we don't have any Roman or Greek records about any of this. But eventually they began, seeing themselves as an independent kingdom. So is that a fulfillment of their goal? For those who are familiar with the history of the American Revolution, did the people who threw tea into Boston Harbor, okay, what's known as the Boston Tea Party, achieved their political goals when the United States declared itself independent. Most historians would say that those people who protested taxes in Boston Harbor had absolutely no goal of becoming an independent country. But that happened very shortly afterwards. So, okay, at what point the Maccabees began seeing their goal as being as achieving Jewish independence is something that we really can't say, but they did do that. Judea did become an independent kingdom. It became a quite powerful kingdom eventually, under the Hasmonean kingdom's successors, until what happened to them is exactly what happened to the Seleucids. Okay, different claimants to the throne began fighting each other. Their kingdom ended in civil war, and just like happened to the Seleucids, the solution to that was being taken over by the Romans.
Professor Levin, thank you so much for today's wonderful interview. It's been very interesting and educational. I would also like to take this time to thank Argov Center for the study of Israel and Jewish people for generously supporting this project. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in next video.